All right, in this explainer, we're going to dive into a fundamental rule of the legal system. It's something that courtroom dramas almost always get wrong, but it is absolutely essential to understand. We're talking about the burden of proof.
You've seen it a million times in movies, right? Two people in a courtroom, emotions are running high, they're pointing fingers. It always looks like this huge dramatic clash where one person's story is just pitted against another's, and whoever tells the most convincing story wins. But, well, that's not really how it works at all. So, that brings up the big question. When you're in a legal fight, does it all just come down to he said, she said? Is it really just your word against the other person's? Most people would say, yeah, of course. But that answer is completely wrong. The idea that it's just an even match of stories is probably one of the biggest myths about the law. The real system has a very specific and frankly a much more interesting rulebook. So let's get into that real rulebook. Because this entire game, it's governed by one single powerful concept that decides who has to do all the heavy lifting. And that concept is the burden of proof. Now, it sounds kind of formal, but all it really means is that it's the legal duty that one person has to prove their claim is true. It's not a suggestion, it's not a nice to have, it is a core requirement of the whole process. And listen, this is probably the most critical mind shift you need to make. If someone accuses you of something or sues you, the game is not about you proving you're innocent. It is entirely about them proving you're guilty, or that their claim has any merit. The spotlight, the pressure, it's all on the accuser, not the person being accused. Okay. So, who gets stuck carrying this heavy weight? How does the court decide where that burden actually falls? Let's break down the rules. Just look at the huge difference here. The claimant, that's the person making the accusation or filing the lawsuit, they have the entire burden. They have to prove it, period. The opponent, on the other hand, they have zero burden to disprove a single thing. I mean, theoretically, they could just sit there, say nothing, and still win the case. This means, if you're the opponent, your entire position can be built on one simple, powerful idea. They made the claim, so they have to prove it. You don't have to waste your time or energy trying to disprove their story or poke holes in every little fact they bring up. Okay, but it gets a little more nuanced than that. The weight of this burden isn't always the same. It actually changes, and changes dramatically, depending on what kind of courtroom you find yourself in. And the difference here is just massive. In civil cases, like a contract dispute or a lawsuit over money, the claimant just needs to prove their case by the greater weight of the evidence. Think of it like a scale. They only need to tip it ever so slightly in their favor, like 51%. But in criminal cases, the standard is astronomically higher. The prosecution has to prove its case beyond and to the exclusion of any reasonable doubt. That is an incredibly heavy burden to carry. All right, so we understand the rule. Now for the fun part. How do you use this to your advantage? Because this isn't just theory. This knowledge is the absolute core of a powerful winning strategy. This right here, this is the golden rule. This is the whole shebang. You don't always win because you have the better story or more evidence. A lot of the time, you win simply because your opponent's case just isn't strong enough. Your entire strategy can be to just point out the holes and show the judge that they haven't met their obligation to prove their claim.
When you boil it all down, it's really this simple. If the person suing you walks into court and fails to provide the real, admissible evidence they need to meet their burden of proof, they lose, and you win. Not because you proved anything, but because they failed to.
So, look, understanding the burden of proof fundamentally changes how you see the legal system. It shifts the power away from the accuser and puts it back on the rules of the game itself. And that leaves us with a really fascinating question. If knowing this one rule is this powerful, what happens when you start to understand all of them?